Dr. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her reading glasses as she sorted through yet another cardboard box in the dusty basement of the Cumberland County Historical Society. At 42 years old, she had spent nearly 2 decades researching Appalachian family histories, but the thrill of discovery never faded. Outside, November rain drummed against the small windows near the ceiling, casting dancing shadows across the concrete floor. The musty smell of old paper and forgotten memories filled her nostrils as she carefully lifted each aged document, examining it with the practiced eye of someone who knew that history often hid in the most unexpected places. The Historical Society building, a converted Presbyterian church from the 1870s, stood on the edge of Harlan, Kentucky, a town that had seen better days. Once a thriving coal mining community, Harlan now struggled with unemployment and population decline. But for Sarah, this place was a goldmine of untold stories, of families whose lives had been shaped by the harsh beauty of the Appalachian Mountains and the unforgiving demands of coal mining. She had driven 3 hours from her office at Eastern Kentucky University that morning, determined to catalog a recent donation of materials from the estate of Evelyn Barlo, a local woman who had passed away at 97, leaving behind a lifetime of collected photographs, letters, and documents. Sarah's assistant, Marcus Chin, a graduate student with an infectious enthusiasm for historical research, called out from across the basement. "Dr. Mitchell, you need to see this." His voice carried an unusual note of excitement that made Sarah look up immediately. Marcus was typically reserved, methodical in his approach to research, so when he showed genuine excitement, it usually meant something significant. She set down the yellowed newspaper clippings she had been examining and walked over to where Marcus stood beside an old oak filing cabinet, its drawers partially open, revealing manila folders stuffed with photographs. "What did you find?" Sarah asked, brushing dust from her hands onto her jeans. Marcus held up a large photograph, roughly 8 by 10 inches, mounted on thick cardboard backing that had warped slightly with age. The image quality was surprisingly good for its apparent age, though the sepia tones had faded unevenly, giving the photograph an almost dreamlike quality. Sarah took the picture from Marcus's hands, holding it carefully by the edges, and immediately understood why he had called her over. The photograph depicted a family of 6 people arranged in what appeared to be the front room of a modest home. The composition was formal, as was typical of early 20th century photography, but something about the image commanded attention. In the center of the photograph sat a stern-looking man, perhaps in his mid-40s, with a thick dark beard and penetrating eyes that seemed to look directly through the camera lens. His clothes were simple but clean, a dark jacket over a collarless shirt, the uniform of a working-class man who had dressed in his Sunday best for this occasion. Beside him sat a woman who appeared to be roughly the same age, her face careworn but retaining traces of earlier beauty. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and she wore a high-neck dress with small buttons running down the front. Her expression was difficult to read, somewhere between resignation and quiet determination. 4 children stood behind and around the seated parents, ranging in age from what appeared to be about 6 to perhaps 14 years old. The children's faces were solemn, as was common in photographs of that era when subjects had to remain still for long exposure times. But what captured Sarah's attention immediately was not the family itself, but the background of the photograph. Behind the children, mounted on the wall, hung a large mirror with an ornate wooden frame. The mirror reflected part of the room, including what appeared to be additional furniture and possibly other elements of the home's interior. Sarah squinted at the reflection, trying to make out details, but the photograph's resolution, while good for its age, made it difficult to see clearly what the mirror revealed. "Look at the back," Marcus said, his voice barely containing his excitement. Sarah turned the photograph over carefully. On the cardboard backing, written in faded brown ink in a careful, deliberate hand, were the words, "The Morrison Family, Harlan County, Kentucky, June 1909. Below that, in what appeared to be a different hand, written in pencil and partially smudged, were additional words that made Sarah's breath catch. The last photograph before everything changed. Sarah looked up at Marcus, her mind already racing with questions. "Have you searched the rest of the box? Are there other photographs? Letters? Anything else about this Morrison family?" Marcus shook his head. This was the only Morrison photograph in the entire donation. I've been through 3 boxes of Evelyn Barlo's materials, and everything else is from different families, mostly from the 1920s and 30s. This one stands out because it's earlier and because of that note on the back. Sarah carried the photograph over to one of the basement's work tables, where better lighting allowed for closer examination. She pulled out her phone and began taking high-resolution photographs of both the front and back of the image. "We need to digitize this properly," she said, her mind already working through the research possibilities. "I want to see what that mirror is reflecting. With modern digital enhancement, we might be able to see details that weren't visible when this was originally printed." The rain outside intensified, and somewhere above them in the old church building, a door slammed in the wind. Sarah barely noticed, her attention completely focused on the Morrison family frozen in time before her. Who were these people? What had changed after this photograph was taken? And why had this image, of all the thousands of family photographs that must have existed in Harlan County in 1909, survived with such an enigmatic notation on its back? These questions would drive her research for the coming weeks, leading her down paths she could never have anticipated, revealing a story that challenged everything she thought she knew about Appalachian family life in the early 20th century. Over the next hour, Sarah and Marcus carefully documented the photograph and continued searching through the remaining boxes from Evelyn Barlo's estate. They found nothing else directly related to the Morrison family, which was both frustrating and intriguing. Sarah made notes about other items that would need further cataloging, but her mind kept returning to that family portrait and its mysterious inscription. Before leaving the Historical Society, she made arrangements with the director, Mrs. Helen Patterson, a retired librarian in her 70s who had dedicated herself to preserving local history, to borrow the Morrison photograph for detailed analysis. Mrs. Patterson, a small woman with silver hair and sharp blue eyes, examined the photograph with interest when Sarah showed it to her. "Morrison," she mused, her weathered fingers touching the edge of the cardboard backing without actually touching the photograph itself. "That's not a name I recall from my research into Harlan County families, and I've been at this for 30 years. That's unusual. Most of the mining families had extensive records, birth certificates, death certificates, coal company employment records. If this family was here in 1900, there should be documentation." Sarah frowned. Could they have moved away shortly after this was taken? That might explain the lack of local records. Mrs. Patterson nodded slowly. Possible. 1909 was right before the big coal boom really took off in Harlan County. A lot of families moved around during that period, chasing work. Some went to West Virginia, some to Pennsylvania. Some just disappeared into the hollows and never made it into official records at all. The mountains have always been good at keeping secrets. That evening, back in her small apartment in Richmond, Kentucky, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the Morrison family. She had scanned the photograph using her high-end flatbed scanner, creating a digital file with far more resolution than her phone could capture. Now, sitting at her desk with a cup of coffee growing cold beside her laptop, she began the painstaking process of digital enhancement. Using professional photo editing software, she increased the contrast, sharpened edges, and slowly, carefully, began to isolate the mirror reflection in the background of the photograph. What she saw made her sit back in her chair, her heart beating faster. The mirror, when properly enhanced and enlarged, revealed details that had been invisible in the original print. The reflection showed not just the room's interior, but something else, something that didn't match the formal, peaceful scene captured in the main photograph. Sarah leaned forward, adjusting the image brightness, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. In the mirror's reflection, barely visible but unmistakable once she knew to look for it, was the figure of another person, someone who was not among the 6 family members posed for the portrait. The figure appeared to be standing in the doorway behind the photographer, partially obscured but clearly present. Sarah could make out what seemed to be a woman's form, wearing what looked like a long dress or coat, her face turned slightly away from the mirror, making identification impossible. But what struck Sarah most forcefully was the body language of this hidden figure. Even in the grainy, enhanced reflection, there was something in the woman's posture that suggested tension, perhaps even distress. One hand appeared to be raised, as if gesturing or reaching toward something outside the frame. Sarah saved the enhanced image and opened a new document, beginning to type her initial observations. Who was this seventh person? Why wasn't she in the formal family portrait? And most importantly, what was her relationship to the Morrison family? Sarah's training as a historian had taught her to be careful about jumping to conclusions, to base her interpretations on evidence rather than imagination. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this photograph held a story far more complex than a simple family portrait. The note on the back, the last photograph before everything changed, suddenly took on new significance. She spent the next several hours searching online genealogical databases, looking for any mention of a Morrison family in Harlan County, Kentucky, around 1909. She found several Morrison families in eastern Kentucky during that period, but none that seemed to match the family in the photograph. Birth records, census data, coal company employment rolls, all came up empty. It was as if this particular Morrison family had existed briefly and then vanished, leaving behind only this single photograph as evidence of their existence. Sarah finally went to bed after midnight, her mind too active for easy sleep. She lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of her apartment building, the distant traffic on the interstate, all the ambient noise of modern life that would have been utterly foreign to the Morrison family in their Appalachian home more than a century ago. Tomorrow, she decided, she would begin a deeper investigation. She would search historical newspapers, church records, coal company archives. Somewhere in the vast documentary record of Appalachian life, there had to be more information about this family and whatever event had prompted that enigmatic note about everything changing. The next morning dawned cold and clear, with frost coating the grass outside Sarah's apartment. She had barely slept, her dreams filled with sepia-toned images and questions without answers. Over a quick breakfast of toast and coffee, she developed a research plan. Her first stop would be the University Library's special collections, which housed an extensive archive of eastern Kentucky newspapers dating back to the mid-1800s. If something significant had happened to the Morrison family after June 1909, there was a chance it might have been reported in the local press. By 9 o'clock, Sarah was at her desk in the Special Collections reading room, surrounded by rolls of microfilm and her laptop open beside her. She had requested all available newspapers from Harlan County and surrounding counties covering the period from June 1909 through December 1910, figuring that if something had happened to the family, it likely occurred within that 18-month window. The reading room was quiet except for the soft whir of the microfilm reader and the occasional turning of pages from other researchers scattered throughout the space. Sarah began systematically scanning through the Harlan County Enterprise, the primary newspaper for the region during that period. The papers were filled with news typical of a small mountain community, notices of church socials, reports on coal production, advertisements for patent medicines and dry goods. She read through accounts of mining accidents, births, deaths, marriages, all the ordinary tragedies and celebrations that made up life in the Appalachian coalfields. But nowhere in the June through August 1909 editions did she find any mention of the Morrison family. She was beginning to feel the familiar frustration that came with historical research, the sense that the answer she sought was just beyond reach, when she noticed a small article on page 3 of the August 27, 1909 edition. The headline read, "Local Family Departs for Western Lands." Sarah leaned closer to the screen, her pulse quickening as she read, "Mr. Thomas Morrison, long employed by the Cumberland Mountain Coal Company, has concluded his business in Harlan County and departed with his family for opportunities in the Montana Territory. Mr. Morrison, along with his wife Catherine and their 4 children, left on the 23rd instant by rail. They will be missed by the community, particularly by the congregation of the First Baptist Church, where Mrs. Morrison was active in charitable works." Sarah sat back, processing this information. So the family had left Kentucky, heading west to Montana. That explained why she had found no further local records. But it raised new questions. What had prompted this move? 1909 was actually a relatively prosperous time for coal mining in eastern Kentucky. Jobs were plentiful, and while the work was dangerous and the pay modest, families like the Morrisons generally had little reason to uproot themselves for the uncertain prospects of Western territories. And what about the mysterious figure in the mirror? Who was she, and what role had she played in the family's story? Sarah photographed the newspaper article with her phone and continued her search. She found no other mentions of the Morrison family in subsequent editions of the Harlan County Enterprise. She expanded her search to newspapers from neighboring counties, including Bell, Leslie, and Letcher, but again found nothing. The family had simply left Kentucky and disappeared from the historical record, at least as far as local documentation was concerned. Sarah made copies of the relevant newspaper pages and gathered her materials, her mind already turning to the next phase of research. If the family had gone to Montana, she would need to search Western archives. But that would take time and probably require travel or at least extensive communication with Montana historical societies and libraries. As she left the library, her phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. Found something interesting in the Barlo materials. Can you come by my office? Sarah texted back that she would be there in 10 minutes and walked quickly across campus, her breath forming small clouds in the cold morning air. Marcus shared an office with 3 other graduate students in the basement of the History Department building, a cramped space filled with overflowing bookshelves and the perpetual smell of coffee. When Sarah arrived, Marcus was alone, sitting at his cluttered desk with his laptop open before him. I couldn't stop thinking about that photograph, Marcus said without preamble, so I came in early this morning and went through the rest of the Barlo donation more carefully. I found this tucked into a Bible that was at the bottom of one of the boxes. He held up a small piece of paper, roughly 3 inches by 5 inches, that looked like it had been torn from a journal or diary. The edges were ragged, and the paper had yellowed with age. Sarah took it carefully, noting that the handwriting was the same careful script that had appeared on the back of the Morrison photograph. The note read, June 15, 1909. Took the family photograph today. Mr. Morrison insisted everyone wear their best clothes. He seems determined to present a proper appearance, though Catherine looked troubled throughout. The children were remarkably well behaved, especially considering the circumstances. I wonder if they understand what's about to happen. I should not write more, but I cannot help feeling that this may be the last time I see them all together. Evelyn has asked me not to interfere, but how can I stand by and watch? May God forgive me if my silence proves to be the greater sin. Sarah read the note 3 times, her mind racing. This was written by Evelyn Barlo, she said slowly. Or rather, by someone Evelyn knew. Someone who was there when the photograph was taken. Marcus nodded. That's what I thought too. And look at the date, June 15th. The photograph is dated June 1909, no specific date, but this note suggests it was taken on June 15th. That's about 10 weeks before the family left for Montana. Sarah sat down heavily in the extra chair beside Marcus's desk. The circumstances, she quoted from the note. What circumstances? And why did this person think they might not see the family together again? She looked at Marcus. We need to find out more about Evelyn Barlo. She clearly had some connection to the Morrison family, intimate enough that someone was confiding in her about the family's situation. Marcus pulled up a document on his laptop. I already started looking into that. Evelyn Barlo was born Evelyn Morrison in 1911, 2 years after this photograph was taken. She died last year at 97, which means she would have been too young to remember 1909 directly. But Morrison, Sarah. That's the same last name. She must have been related to the family in the photograph, maybe a niece or cousin. Sarah felt a thrill of excitement. If Evelyn was born a Morrison, then she might have family papers, letters, documents that could tell us more about what happened to the family. Did she have any children? Anyone we could contact? Marcus shook his head. According to the obituary I found, she never married and had no children. She spent most of her life working as a schoolteacher in Harlan County. The Historical Society received her estate because she had specified in her will that any historical materials should be donated to them for preservation. Sarah pulled out her phone and called Mrs. Patterson at the Historical Society. After explaining what they had found, she asked whether there were any other materials from Evelyn Barlo's estate that hadn't yet been transferred to the society. Mrs. Patterson promised to check and call her back. While they waited, Sarah showed Marcus the newspaper article she had found about the family's departure for Montana. Together, they began searching online databases for Montana historical records, trying to trace what had happened to the Morrison family after they left Kentucky. They found census records showing that Montana had indeed experienced a population boom in the early 20th century, with many families from eastern states relocating to take advantage of homesteading opportunities and the expansion of copper mining in cities like Butte. But finding one specific family among thousands of newcomers was like searching for a needle in a haystack, especially given the limited digitization of Montana historical records from that period. Mrs. Patterson called back within an hour. "I checked with the attorney who handled Evelyn's estate," she said. "There were some additional boxes of personal papers that hadn't been included in the initial transfer because they were still being sorted when the estate was settled. I can have them sent over to the Historical Society by tomorrow. You're welcome to examine them as soon as they arrive." That evening, Sarah returned to her apartment and spent hours researching the social context of Appalachian life in 1909. She wanted to understand what might have prompted a family to leave during what should have been a relatively stable period. She read academic articles about coal mining communities, about the role of women in Appalachian society, about the economic and social pressures that shaped family life in the mountains. The picture that emerged was one of a world in transition, where traditional ways of life were being disrupted by industrial development, where families struggled to maintain their independence and dignity in the face of corporate power and economic uncertainty. Coal mining had transformed eastern Kentucky in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. What had once been isolated farming communities became industrial outposts, with coal camps springing up wherever seams of coal could be profitably extracted. The coal companies wielded enormous power, owning not just the mines but often the housing, stores, and even churches in the camps. Workers were paid in scrip, company-issued currency that could only be spent at company stores, creating a system of economic dependence that was difficult to escape. Life expectancy for miners was short, with cave-ins, explosions, and black lung disease claiming thousands of lives. Wives and children lived with the constant knowledge that their husband or father might not return from his shift underground. Yet despite these harsh conditions, Appalachian communities developed strong bonds of mutual support. Extended families lived in close proximity, sharing resources and labor. Churches provided not just spiritual guidance but social services, helping families in crisis. Women, while often invisible in official records, played crucial roles in maintaining household economies through gardening, preserving food, and sometimes taking in laundry or sewing to supplement family income. Sarah found herself developing a mental picture of what life might have been like for Catherine Morrison, the woman in the photograph. She would have been responsible for feeding and clothing 4 children on whatever wages her husband brought home from the coal mine. She would have worried constantly about her husband's safety, would have known other wives who had been widowed by mining accidents. And according to the note in Evelyn Barlo's papers, Catherine had been troubled during the taking of the family photograph. But what circumstances was the note writer referring to? Sarah made herself dinner, barely tasting the pasta as she ate mechanically while continuing to read on her laptop. She found an academic paper about family dissolution in Appalachian mining communities, discussing how economic stress, mining accidents, and disease could tear families apart. Some families were broken up when children were sent to live with relatives because parents couldn't afford to feed them. Some women, left widowed and destitute, had no choice but to place children in orphanages. Some families simply disappeared from the historical record, probably moving frequently in search of better opportunities, leaving no trace behind. Could something like this have happened to the Morrisons? But the newspaper article said the whole family had left together for Montana. That didn't sound like a family in crisis, but rather like a family making a planned decision to seek new opportunities elsewhere. The more Sarah learned, the more questions she had. She stayed up late into the night, filling a notebook with timelines, questions, and possible research directions. She sketched out what she knew: the Morrison family, June 15, 1909, photographed in their home in Harlan County. Thomas Morrison worked for the Cumberland Mountain Coal Company. Catherine Morrison was active in the Baptist Church. They had 4 children. Approximately 10 weeks after the photograph was taken, the family left Kentucky for Montana. Evelyn Morrison, born 1911, was somehow related to the family and had preserved the photograph and at least one document suggesting that the family's situation in June 1909 was more complicated than the formal portrait suggested. And then there was the figure in the mirror, the mysterious seventh person whose presence in the photograph had gone unnoticed for over a century. Who was she? Was she the person who had written the note found in Evelyn's Bible? Was she a family member? A friend? And what role had she played in whatever events led to the family's departure from Kentucky? The next morning, Sarah received a call from Mrs. Patterson informing her that the additional boxes from Evelyn Barlo's estate had arrived at the Historical Society. Sarah canceled her afternoon classes and drove immediately to Harlan, her mind filled with anticipation. The November day was overcast, with low clouds obscuring the tops of the mountains that lined the narrow valley. As she drove the winding roads through the Cumberland Gap, Sarah thought about how little this landscape had changed in the centuries since the Morrison family had lived here. The mountains were eternal, their ridges and hollows still covered with the same hardwood forests that had witnessed generations of human struggle and survival. Mrs. Patterson met her at the Historical Society with 3 additional boxes, each carefully labeled with Evelyn Barlo's name and the notation, personal correspondence and documents. Sarah and Marcus, who had made the drive with her, set up in the basement workroom and began carefully sorting through the materials. The boxes contained a lifetime of papers, teaching certificates, report cards, letters from former students, financial documents, church bulletins. But buried in the second box, wrapped in faded tissue paper, they found what they had been hoping for, a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon, and beneath them, a leather-bound journal with Evelyn Morrison Barlo's name embossed in gold on the cover. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she untied the ribbon and carefully unfolded the first letter. It was dated March 1912 and addressed to, "My dear niece Evelyn." The letter was signed by Catherine Morrison. Sarah looked at Marcus, hardly daring to believe their luck. Catherine Morrison wrote to Evelyn, "If we're lucky, these letters might tell us what happened to the family after they left Kentucky." They spent the next 2 hours reading through the collection of letters, piecing together a story that was both heartbreaking and illuminating. Catherine Morrison had indeed written regularly to her niece Evelyn, who had remained in Kentucky after the family's departure. The early letters, from 1912 through 1914, painted a picture of a family trying to establish itself in Montana. Thomas had found work not in mining but as a ranch hand, and later as a foreman for a large cattle operation outside of Billings. The family lived in a small house on the ranch property. The children were enrolled in a one-room schoolhouse. Catherine wrote about the stark beauty of the Montana landscape, so different from the green mountains of Kentucky. She wrote about making new friends, joining a church, learning to adapt to Western ways. But beneath the surface optimism of these letters, Sarah detected undercurrents of tension and unspoken pain. In a letter dated July 1913, Catherine wrote, "Evelyn, my dear, I must confess that despite all the beauty and opportunity we have found here, I cannot forget what we left behind. There are nights when I wake from dreams of home, and the weight of our decision presses upon me like a physical burden. Thomas says I must look forward, not backward, and he is right, of course. The children are thriving here, and we have prospects we never could have hoped for in Kentucky. But oh, how I miss the hills, and the sound of familiar voices, and all the small comforts of the life we knew. And I think often of Margaret. I pray she has found peace, wherever she may be." Sarah looked up from the letter. Margaret? That name hasn't appeared before. Who was Margaret? She and Marcus searched through the other letters, looking for additional mentions. They found several, scattered across letters from different years. In October 1913, Catherine wrote, "I received word from Mrs. Thompson that Margaret has settled somewhere in West Virginia. At least I know she is alive, though the circumstances of her new life pain me to imagine. I tell myself that we did what we had to do, what was best for everyone, but conviction does not always ease a troubled conscience." A letter from April 1915 was even more revealing. "Thomas has finally agreed that we might send money to help Margaret establish herself more securely. It has taken nearly 6 years, but I believe he has begun to understand that what we did, while perhaps necessary, was also cruel. The children ask about their sister sometimes, especially Mary, who was old enough to remember. I tell them that Margaret had to make her own way in the world, and that we must respect her choice. But they sense, as children do, that there is more to the story than I am telling them. Sister. Sarah felt the pieces beginning to fall into place. The mysterious figure in the mirror, the one who hadn't been included in the formal family photograph, must have been Margaret Morrison, an older daughter who for some reason had been excluded from the family portrait and who had subsequently been separated from the family. She turned to the journal, hoping to find more details. Evelyn Barlo's journal began in 1920, when she was 9 years old. The early entries were brief and childish, recounting everyday events with the simplicity of youth. But as Evelyn grew older, the entries became longer and more reflective. In 1925, when Evelyn was 14, she wrote an entry that made Sarah's breath catch. Mother told me today about Aunt Catherine's older daughter, my cousin Margaret. I never knew she existed until now. Mother says Margaret was written out of the family because of something that happened before they left Kentucky, something shameful that nobody talks about. But Mother also said that Margaret was the kindest, bravest person she ever knew, and that what happened to her was terribly unfair. I asked why she was written out of the family photograph, and Mother said it was because Aunt Catherine's husband, my Uncle Thomas, refused to acknowledge her after she disgraced the family name. Mother says the world is often cruel to women who make mistakes or who refuse to accept what society demands of them. Sarah and Marcus sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the implications of what they had read. Margaret Morrison had been excluded from her family's portrait, and shortly thereafter, the family had left Kentucky without her, essentially abandoning her to make her own way. What had she done that was considered so disgraceful that her father would deny her existence? And what role had Catherine played in this decision? The letters suggested that Catherine had harbored guilt and regret about Margaret's fate, but had she actively participated in excluding her daughter, or had she simply acquiesced to her husband's demands? Sarah pulled up the enhanced photograph on her laptop and studied the reflection in the mirror once more. Now, knowing who Margaret Morrison probably was, she looked at the figure with new understanding. Margaret had been in the room when the photograph was taken, standing behind the photographer, watching her family pose for what would become a permanent record of a family that no longer included her. Sarah tried to imagine what that must have felt like, to be physically present but deliberately excluded, to see your parents and siblings arranged as if you didn't exist. The emotional weight of that moment was almost overwhelming to contemplate. "We need to find out what happened to Margaret," Sarah said quietly. "If she went to West Virginia, there might be records there. Marriage records, census data, anything that could help us trace her life after the family left her behind." Marcus nodded. "I'll start searching West Virginia archives." "But Sarah, even if we find records of what happened to Margaret, we still don't know what she did that caused the family to reject her. The letters mention disgrace and shame, but they never specify what the actual transgression was." Sarah thought about this. "We need to be careful about speculation," she said. In 1909, there were lots of things that could bring shame on a family. An unmarried pregnancy would have been considered scandalous. So would defying parental authority in certain ways, like refusing an arranged marriage or becoming involved with someone considered unsuitable. Some families even rejected daughters who wanted to pursue education or careers instead of marrying young. Without more specific information, we can't know for certain what happened. They continued searching through Evelyn's journal, looking for additional clues. In an entry from 1930, Evelyn, now 19 and working as a teacher in a small school in Harlan County, wrote about receiving a letter from her Aunt Catherine. Aunt Catherine writes that she has finally made peace with the past. She has been corresponding with Margaret for several years now, sending money when she can. Margaret married a coal miner in West Virginia and has 3 children of her own. Aunt Catherine says that Margaret has found happiness despite everything, and that she has forgiven the family for abandoning her. But Aunt Catherine writes that she herself cannot forgive what was done. She says that Uncle Thomas acted according to what he believed was right, but that his righteousness was harsh and unforgiving, and that she should have fought harder to protect her daughter. She writes that she thinks often of that last day in Harlan, when the photographer came to take the family portrait. She knew even then that it was wrong to exclude Margaret, but she lacked the courage to stand up to her husband. She says she will carry that regret to her grave. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she read this. The human cost of this family drama, played out over decades and across the vast distance between Montana and West Virginia, was heartbreaking. She thought about Catherine Morrison, caught between her husband's rigid sense of propriety and her love for her daughter, making what must have seemed like an impossible choice. And she thought about Thomas Morrison, whose determination to maintain respectability had led him to reject his own child. What kind of man could do that? But Sarah knew from her research that such actions were not uncommon in that era. Families routinely severed ties with members who brought shame or scandal, believing that protecting the family's reputation was more important than individual relationships. "I think I understand the note on the back of the photograph now," Marcus said. "The last photograph before everything changed. Whoever wrote that knew that this was the end of the Morrison family as it had existed, that after this moment, nothing would ever be the same." Sarah nodded. "And I think I know who wrote it. The handwriting matches the note we found in the Bible. This must have been written by whoever was confiding in Evelyn, probably Evelyn's mother, Catherine Morrison's sister. She would have been there when the photograph was taken, would have witnessed the family's crisis and understood the significance of Margaret's absence from the portrait." As the afternoon wore on, Sarah and Marcus continued their research, finding additional pieces of the puzzle in Evelyn's papers. They discovered that Margaret Morrison had indeed settled in West Virginia, marrying a man named James Harper in 1913. Census records showed the couple living in a coal camp near Charleston, raising 3 children through the Depression years. Margaret had died in 1958 at the age of 68, a respectable lifespan for someone of her generation and circumstances. The family had eventually reconciled, at least partially, with Catherine corresponding with Margaret until Catherine's death in 1935. But Thomas Morrison never acknowledged his eldest daughter again, taking his righteousness and rigidity to his grave in 1941. Sarah sat back, overwhelmed by the weight of the story they had uncovered. What had begun as a simple historical curiosity, a family photograph with an unusual notation, had revealed itself to be a profound human drama about love, duty, shame, forgiveness, and the price families paid for social respectability in early 20th century America. The photograph now took on new meaning for Sarah. It wasn't just a document of a family's appearance, but a record of a moment of profound transition when one family member was deliberately erased from the official narrative while remaining hauntingly present in the mirror's reflection. Over the following weeks, Sarah devoted herself to understanding Margaret Morrison's story as completely as possible. She contacted historical societies in West Virginia, requesting records related to Margaret Harper, as she had become known after her marriage. She searched through coal company records, church registers, and local newspapers, slowly building a picture of Margaret's life after leaving Kentucky. What emerged was a portrait of a woman who had endured hardship and rejection but had nevertheless built a meaningful life for herself and her children. Sarah discovered that Margaret had worked as a laundress and occasional seamstress to supplement her husband's mining income. She had been active in her local church, serving as a Sunday school teacher and helping to organize charitable efforts for mining families affected by accidents or illness. Her children had all survived to adulthood, a testament to Margaret's care during an era when childhood mortality was high. One daughter had become a teacher, one son a railroad worker, and another son had moved to Ohio to work in manufacturing. Margaret's descendants were scattered across several states, living ordinary American lives, completely unaware of their ancestors' story. Through genealogical websites and social media, Sarah eventually managed to contact one of Margaret's great-granddaughters, a woman named Linda Harper Stevens who lived in Columbus, Ohio. Sarah called her one evening in early December, explaining her research and asking if Linda knew anything about her great-grandmother's early life in Kentucky. Linda was fascinated and surprised by Sarah's call. "I knew very little about great-grandma Margaret's family," Linda said. "My grandmother, Margaret's daughter, always said that Margaret came from Kentucky but that she had been estranged from her family there. We assumed there had been some kind of falling out, but no one ever explained what happened. Do you know why she left Kentucky?" Sarah hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. She had learned enough from the letters and journal entries to have a strong suspicion about what had caused Margaret's estrangement from her family, but she had no definitive proof. The historical records suggest that there was a family conflict of some kind, Sarah said carefully. It appears that Margaret's father, your great-great-grandfather Thomas Morrison, was a rather rigid man who had very strict ideas about proper behavior. Whatever Margaret did or didn't do, it led to her being separated from the family when they moved to Montana. But your great-grandmother eventually reconciled with her mother, Catherine, even though she never saw her father again. Linda was quiet for a moment. That must have been so hard for her, she finally said. Imagine being cut off from your entire family like that. But I think maybe that explains something my grandmother told me once. She said her mother, my great-grandmother Margaret, always insisted that families should stick together no matter what, that you should never give up on people you love. We thought it was just general advice, but maybe it came from her own experience of being abandoned. Sarah felt a lump in her throat. Linda, would you be willing to share any family photographs or documents you might have from your great-grandmother? I'm planning to write an academic article about the Morrison family, and I think Margaret's story deserves to be told properly. Linda agreed enthusiastically, promising to search through family materials and send Sarah anything relevant. 2 weeks later, Sarah received a package containing several photographs of Margaret Harper as an older woman, along with copies of letters Margaret had written to her daughters later in life. In one letter, written in 1955 when Margaret was 65 years old, she wrote words that Sarah found profoundly moving. My dear girls, I want you to understand that despite everything that happened when I was young, despite the pain of being rejected by my father and separated from my siblings, I have had a good life. Your father loved me truly, and you children have been my greatest joy. If I could go back and change what happened, I'm not sure I would, because that path led me to the family I have now. But I hope you will teach your own children that love is more important than pride, and that forgiveness is more important than being right. Sarah now had enough material to write a comprehensive article about the Morrison family and the photograph that had started her investigation. But she felt that the story deserved a broader audience than just academic journals. She contacted a documentary filmmaker she had worked with on previous projects, a woman named Rachel Simmons who specialized in historical documentaries for public television. Rachel was immediately interested in the story. It's perfect, Rachel said during their first meeting. It has mystery, human drama, and it touches on broader themes about family, gender, and social change in early 20th century America. And the photograph itself is such a powerful visual element, especially with the figure in the mirror. It's like something out of a Victorian novel, except it's all real. They began planning a documentary that would tell Margaret Morrison's story within the broader context of Appalachian women's lives in the early 20th century. Rachel arranged to film interviews with Sarah, with Mrs. Patterson at the Historical Society, with Linda Harper Stevens, and with several academic experts on Appalachian history and women's history. They traveled to Harlan County to film the landscape and the few remaining structures from the coal mining era. They even located the approximate site where the Morrison family's house had stood, though the building itself had long since vanished, replaced by a modern trailer park. The documentary, titled The Mirror's Truth, One Family's Hidden Story, premiered on public television in March 2025. The response was overwhelming. Sarah received dozens of emails from viewers who had been moved by Margaret's story, many from people who had their own family histories of estrangement and reconciliation. Several viewers shared their own discoveries of hidden figures in old family photographs, people who had been deliberately excluded or forgotten. The documentary sparked conversations about how families deal with shame and scandal, how social norms shape family relationships, and how the past continues to echo in the present. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Linda Harper Stevens. A week after the documentary aired, she called Sarah with news that several other descendants of Margaret Morrison had reached out to her after seeing the program. We're planning a family reunion this summer, Linda said, her voice full of excitement. All of Margaret's descendants, and we've also been in contact with some descendants of Margaret's siblings from Montana. We're finally bringing the family back together after more than a century. I never would have known these relatives existed if you hadn't done this research. Thank you for telling Margaret's story. Thank you for making sure she wasn't forgotten. Sarah found herself deeply moved by this unexpected outcome. Historical research had always been about more than just uncovering facts for her. It was about understanding the human experiences behind those facts, about giving voice to people whose stories had been silenced or marginalized. Margaret Morrison had been written out of her family's official narrative, excluded from the portrait that should have included her. But by paying attention to what the mirror revealed, by looking carefully at what had been hidden in plain sight, Sarah had been able to restore Margaret's place in her family's history. On a warm evening in late May, Sarah sat in her apartment reviewing the final version of her academic article about the Morrison family. The article would be published in the Journal of Appalachian Studies, adding to the scholarly understanding of family dynamics and social change in early 20th century mountain communities. But beyond its academic contribution, Sarah knew that the article and the documentary had served a more fundamental purpose. They had honored Margaret Morrison's life and choices, whatever those choices had been. They had acknowledged the pain of family estrangement and the possibility of eventual healing. And they had demonstrated that historical photographs were not just static images of the past, but complex documents that could reveal hidden stories when examined with care and empathy. Sarah pulled up the enhanced image of the Morrison family photograph on her computer screen, looking once more at the figure in the mirror. Margaret Morrison, standing behind the photographer, watching her family pose without her. Sarah wondered what Margaret had been thinking at that moment. Had she been angry? Heartbroken? Defiant? Had she already known that she would never see her father again, that her siblings would grow up hundreds of miles away, that she would have to build a new life entirely on her own? The photograph couldn't answer these questions, but it preserved the moment, ensuring that Margaret's presence, however hidden, would eventually be recognized and acknowledged. Sarah thought about all the other hidden figures in historical photographs, all the people who had been deliberately excluded or marginalized, whose stories remained untold. How many other mirrors held reflected images of people who didn't fit into the official family narrative? How many other photographs contained clues to dramas and conflicts that had been carefully concealed? The work of historical research, Sarah reflected, was never truly finished. There were always more stories to uncover, more voices to recover from silence, more hidden truths waiting to be brought into the light. As the sun set outside her window, painting the Kentucky sky in shades of orange and purple, Sarah saved her work and closed her laptop. Tomorrow she would begin a new research project, diving into another set of historical records, searching for other forgotten stories. But tonight, she simply sat quietly, thinking about Margaret Morrison and the long, eventful life she had lived after that June day in 1909. Margaret had survived rejection and hardship. She had built a family of her own, raised children, worked hard, and apparently found a measure of peace and happiness. Her story had been buried for over a century, but now it had been told, and in the telling, Margaret Morrison had finally been restored to her rightful place in her family's history. The mirror had kept her secret, but eventually, when someone looked closely enough, the mirror had also revealed the truth. And that truth, Sarah believed, was worth all the hours of research, all the careful detective work, all the effort it had taken to piece together the fragments of one woman's life from the scattered documents and faded photographs that had survived the passage of time.